Oh, that's horrible.
On the 21st of September, the news broke that Telltale Games was closing down and that almost all of their 250 staff were asked to leave the studio. While we knew they'd been struggling for a while, this is still a horrible way for a studio that's been behind some truly iconic games to go. However you slice it, this is a real loss for the games industry, and we hope that every single person who worked there lands on their feet. The point-and-click adventure reached its golden era in the late 90s and early 2000s, with titles like The Curse of Monkey Island, Sam & Max Hit the Road, and Titanic Adventure Out of Time. But by the late 2000s, and definitely by 2010, the genre was pretty much dead, put out to pasture with the text-based games, MMORPGs, and on-rail shooters of yesteryear.
In 2010, AMC's TV adaptation of Robert Kirkman's hit comic book series The Walking Dead got underway. The show's comic book origins and success meant that the video game version felt inevitable. What nobody expected was that Telltale, a studio best known for episodic, graphic adventure games, would be behind an adaptation that was as original as it was brilliant, pulling the corpse of point-and-click adventure games out the ground and giving them a new lease of life.
The season was a real cornerstone in a number of ways, but what made it stand out so much was it totally ignored the design philosophy that has been at the heart of game development since the very beginning, that gameplay comes first.
While narrative is becoming more and more important in games, and the balance between story and gameplay keeps getting closer, you very rarely see a studio put story first and gameplay second. But that's exactly what Telltale have done with all their games since the first season of The Walking Dead, and it's right at the heart of who they are.
Telltale have released 11 games since the first season of The Walking Dead. Some good, some not so good, but they really failed to recapture the magic and the essence of what made Lee's story so compelling to play. This may be part of why the studio had to close its doors, but we don't know enough of what went on behind the scenes to do a what went wrong kind of video. So instead, we're asking the question, what could Telltale Games have done to change their formula? If you like this kind of video, don't forget to make the right choice and subscribe.
Following up on anything that's successful is a challenge, no matter what industry you're in. When you sit down to make the follow-up album to that masterpiece, you're stuck with a choice. Do you give people more of the same, or do you give them something new?
More often than not, the best approach is a balance between the two. Look at one of the best studios around, Rockstar Games. All of Rockstar Games follow a simple formula of being open sandboxes that mix dynamic storytelling, where you're the director of your own carnage, with a scripted narrative. But each game is distinctively different, each iteration is changed from the last, and each offers something that no other Rockstar game has before. That's an example of a studio that knows its strengths and are willing to take risks and explore new avenues within that framework.
Telltale, on the other hand, chose to stick with what worked before, to the point where their games basically became their own genre. If you describe a game as a Telltale game, then people know exactly what you're talking about and what to expect. While this does create a sense of recognition, the games industry moves so fast that anyone making games that play exactly the same way for years is going to struggle.
We're not sure what was behind this approach of sticking so closely to the formula they had created. Whether it was stubbornness, a quest to try and recapture the magic of the first season of The Walking Dead, or in pursuit of carving out their own niche in the industry. It might actually be because Telltale were a victim of their own success. Licensed games are incredibly hard to do right, but then this little studio comes along and does something wonderful with a licensed property. Now suddenly, everyone wants a piece.
And Telltale were happy to give it to them, taking on multiple licensed games. Game of Thrones, Guardians of the Galaxy, Batman, all massive properties with their own dedicated fan bases. Taking on these sorts of projects sounded great on paper, but comes with an obligation to deliver a quality product. The fear of not disappointing fans is hard to avoid with massive properties, and that's not an environment that encourages innovation, but pushes it aside in favour of the familiar, of tried and tested.
If Telltale had taken on less licenses and put a couple of smaller teams working on original IPs, they might have had room to experiment. Single short experiences that introduce new twists on the Telltale way of doing things, mixing up the blend between gameplay and narrative, and exploring new avenues of interactivity.
It's not even like they would have had to release less games. With a more diverse portfolio, they wouldn't have oversaturated the market with their own products. Fans would have looked forward to the next Telltale game, just to see what spin they had cooked up to make the game distinctive. But Telltale's refusal to change extends more than to just game design.
One of the unique selling points of Season 1 of The Walking Dead was the way it felt like an amazing choose-your-own-adventure book that you could play. The consequences felt so real, and because the choices it gave you were never black and white with no distinction between right and wrong, it genuinely had some soul-destroying moments.
But as the game goes on, you realise that actually, it doesn't really matter what you choose. The story is always going to end exactly the same way, it's just the ride might be a little different. This illusion of choice became part of the Telltale formula, to the point where the welcome screen reading, "Each choice you make impacts the story," started to feel like a broken promise.
There's nothing wrong with telling a focused story with a set beginning, middle and end. Just look at Uncharted or the new God of War. But in such a competitive environment, when other games like Detroit and Until Dawn are giving players the power to truly shape their own adventure, you quickly get left behind if you don't adapt.
If Telltale didn't really keep up with what other games are offering in terms of player agency, they definitely didn't keep up when it came in terms of their game engine. The Telltale tool was what they built all their games on. And while in 2012 you could forgive the then small studio for constant bugs and janky graphics, 6 years and lots of games later, it's much harder to accept. Especially when you look around the rest of the industry. If you can play a 100-hour RPG like The Witcher and only encounter a few bugs here and there, this small few-hour point-and-click adventure really doesn't have an excuse.
While each new game did bring a new lick of paint and some hope for improvement, they never managed to get it to a point where their games ran smoothly. It's hard to tell why they never really invested in fixing this, especially as it was the one thing everybody complained about. Maybe they had too many projects to focus on, or maybe it just wasn't a priority for them.
It was only at the end of August, a mere month before Telltale closed its doors, that they publicly announced their plan to use the Unity engine for the now cancelled Wolf Among Us Season 2 and Stranger Things games. It seems Telltale had finally taken the plunge to move away from the Telltale tool. Unfortunately, we'll never see how this could have worked out for them.
Making sure your people have right tools is obviously really important no matter what you do, but you also have to give that same attention to your people.
Looking back now, the Spike Video Game Awards in 2012 is really when Telltale Games reached its peak. Having The Walking Dead announced as Game of the Year thrust the small developer into the limelight and put a focus on engaging and emotional storytelling over big-budget, high-fidelity gaming. This rise continued over the next few years, as talented writers and developers flocked to what seemed to be a blossoming gem in the industry.
However, 2 years after greenlighting projects on massive franchises such as Batman and Game of Thrones, Telltale announced in 2017 that they were laying off roughly a quarter of their workforce. This mass exodus opened the floodgates of accusations of a toxic work environment, creative suppression and long working hours, all pointed towards poor management at the studio.
There's a bunch more details and accusations that have come out since about the working environment of Telltale Games, and again, we need to state that we don't know the truth of what happened there, but there is enough information out there for us to assume that it struggled to transition from a small studio to one handling many large projects.
Retaining talent is super important within any enterprise, especially for those that operate within a creative medium. Now, it would be unfair to say that the quality of their games dipped massively, because that's definitely not the case. But if you lose lots of super talented writers and developers, you're always going to struggle to recapture the magic of that first breakout success.
So, how could have Telltale changed their formula? Well, it's a combination of many things. We for one would have liked them to see do original IPs, which would have given them a bit of a jumping off point in terms of trying to try out new things. To try and take on less projects, to try and make each game the best that it could be, and obviously treat their staff more fairly in a way just to retain all that talent. In what is a bit of irony, Telltale's story is quite similar to the point and click adventure genre that they so skillfully reimagined. Telltale were left behind by other games in terms of narrative and gameplay, and they released so many games it made their own formula feel stale. We wish it hadn't, because, well, despite everything, they made some genuinely great games, and actually going to be a huge loss to the wider gaming community. But that's just our thoughts. What do you think Telltale could have done to change their formula up? Please let us know in the comments underneath, and if you like this sort of video, don't forget to subscribe to our wee magical channel. Thanks for watching.